Moving on to Chapter 12, Public Relations. This is Ralph Hanson's definition of public relations, and let me point out a few components of it. It's a management function. So, in other words, the head of the public relations department may work directly for the top management of the organization. A public relations person establishes and maintains mutually beneficial relationships. I think the job of a public relations person is a go-between, really, between an organization and the publics. Note publics. It's not just one group of people or one interest group that public relations need to manage. It's a lot of different groups of people who are important to an organization's success or failure. This is the history segment in the public relations chapter. One root of public relations is 19th century press agentry. Press agents were all about publicity. They weren't too terribly into accuracy. It was one-way communication. It's not like they took a lot of feedback from journalists or from customers or from the public. They were all about getting their client's name in the paper by any means possible. P.T. Barnum was a very successful early press agent. When his circus would travel, Barnum would make sure that there was plenty of advance publicity, to the degree that his top performers had short names like Tom Thumb or Jenny Lind, easier to put them into a newspaper headline. And when the circus came to town, Barnum made sure that the trip from the rail station to the fairgrounds, or wherever the big top would be erected, that there would be a tremendous parade so that everybody would know that the circus was indeed in town. Edward L. Bernays, I think the term evil genius probably applies. On the genius end of things, he was married to Sigmund Freud's niece, and he was apparently very taken with Uncle Sigmund. And as a result of that, he tried to use the same sort of social science research techniques that Freud was using to map out the individual's mind, except Bernays was trying to map out the group mind. Bernays' classic definition of public relations was the engineering of consent. The engineering of consent. So to Bernays, whether you were asking people to go to war or just buy a hamburger, it was all a matter of technique. If you used principles of psychology and motivation, you could move the crowd in the direction that you wanted. His book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, is considered to be the first ever public relations textbook. He wrote a later book that was bluntly titled Propaganda. So to Bernays, it was all about the crowd. Here's a picture of the man himself, Bernays, and here is what I believe is a rather chilling quote. I mean, take a good look at this quote. We can understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind. Is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? And then for the big closing, the recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible. Bernays' first great public relations campaign was the Beechnut Packing Company, makers of bacon in a can. And Beechnut hired Bernays because they wanted to popularize the idea of a heartier breakfast. This was at a time when most American adults maybe had coffee and toast for breakfast. So, how to make bacon into a breakfast food? He began with the company's doctor and wrote for the doctor a rather leading survey. And what I mean by that was that Bernays asked questions in such a way that he could, to some degree, control the answers. And this leading set of questions, designed to get the respondent to say, why, yes, a heartier breakfast perhaps would be good for people under certain conditions. Well, this questionnaire got sent out by the Beechnut Company's doctor to his colleagues in the medical association, many of whom dutifully filled out the questionnaire, and Bernays, getting the responses that he wanted, turned it into a sort of pseudo-scientific paper, the findings of which he touted mercilessly to the press. Well, Bernays got his way. He was able to effect what turned out to be a permanent change in American breakfast habits, which certainly included bacon. This is where the evil part of Bernays' evil genius, I think, really begins to kick in. Shortly after being hired by the Beechnut Company, he was hired by American Tobacco, the maker of Lucky Strike cigarettes. And the goal of company management was to get more women smoking. In the 1920s, there were some women smoking, but wholesome, girl next door types, they generally didn't smoke. Bernays' first thought was to change the color on the Lucky Strike package so that it could become a fashion accessory. Well, the head of the American Tobacco Company was against that. He felt that there was a lot of brand equity in that particular shade of Lucky Strike green, so the color wasn't changing. Well, Bernays went the other way. He was somehow able to get that shade of green into the fall Paris color fashion palette. And suddenly, that shade of Lucky Strike green was fashionable. The woman in this photo is Bernays' personal secretary. He taught her to smoke. Her job was to recruit a group of wholesome-looking young women who would smoke publicly in the New York Easter Parade down Fifth Avenue, proudly and openly smoking. Well, this group of women, Bernays certainly got publicity for in the New York Times, and then from the Times it went out over the wire services and got picked up by other publications across the nation. And Bernays didn't just see this as women picking up a new habit. He saw it as female empowerment. In fact, he called cigarettes torches of freedom. So take a look at this ad for Lucky Strike back from Bernays' time. An ancient prejudice has been removed. It was a time of female empowerment, greater freedoms for women, and Bernays was able to make the case that smoking cigarettes was one of those new freedoms. Note that if it worked in the 1920s, it would work in the 1970s. Also on this slide is an ad for Virginia Slims, which used a same feminist appeal in the 1970s. In fact, when I was doing research on Bernays about 4 years ago, I found that at that time There was a brand of cigarettes in Spain that was continuing to use that sort of pseudo-feminist appeal, and apparently it was still working. Bernays, who lived to be 103, has a surprising amount of continuing influence in the world of public relations. For example, his classic definition of the functions of public relations continue to be valid today. Certainly, part of public relations is informing the customer, informing the public, informing the investors. If we're talking about Glendale College, informing students, informing the families of students, informing the community. Another function of public relations is persuading. Remember, we are, after all, talking about the engineering of consent. Does our organization want the local citizens to not be too upset about pollution? Do we represent a building developer who wants a housing development in the community? It's all a matter of engineering consent. Integrating, in this case, means integrating your public relations activities with your lobbying activities, your marketing activities, your advertising activities. Let's look at a more modern version of a public relations campaign. It's called the ropes process. And please note that it's all in capital letters, so that suggests that it's an acronym. The R in the ropes process is research. We research what are some opportunities for our client. Maybe they have some things that there is a market that could come to them, that they have built-in advantages that maybe they haven't quite realized. Of course, then again, in your research, you may turn up that your client has certain problems, certain built-in problems, maybe long-standing. It could be a very real problem, or it could just be an unfortunate perception. And then there are issues. Oftentimes these issues may hang over an entire industry, maybe an entire society. Maybe those issues have nothing to do with the business itself. Maybe it has to do with the population they serve or the city that they are in. O is objectives. What do you want this public relations campaign to do? What are your goals? Public relations campaigns are run through a thing called MBOs, Management by Objectives. And those objectives should be specific. They should be measurable. You should be able to tell at the end of the cycle whether you have met your objective, whether you fell just short, in which case maybe you could tweak it for round 2 and meet your objective, or did you fail by a wide margin, which means that maybe you should think about abandoning that objective. P is programming. What specifically will you do as part of this public relations campaign? E is evaluation. We have now been through our first round of our public relations campaign. Some things have worked well. One of the old sayings is look for the upside surprise. What worked better than expected, build on it. What worked pretty well, see if you can make it do a little bit better. What almost made it, see if you can get it over the hump. And what should you not spend any more of your time on? S is stewardship. You have gone through this whole arduous process of creating a public relations campaign. Now maintain it. Build on it. Don't let it wither and die, because presumably you have created something of value. Public relations people don't just see the public. They see many publics. And you'd say, then what is a public? Well, a public is a group of people who share a common set of interests and goals. I mean, think about a politician, maybe a local politician running for city council. Who would be the various groups of voters, the various publics that they would want to appeal to? Environmentalists, small business owners, people who want a strong police force, people who believe in robust public education, and so on and so forth. Any organization has internal publics and external publics. So internal publics would be groups of people with common interests and goals inside an organization. Well, oftentimes various labor groups within the organization are internal publics. External publics are groups outside the organization, people who may be in a position to help you, or may be in a position to hurt you, or they may be a group of people who, depending upon how you treat them, they could break one way or the other. A big part of what public relations do is to deal with the media, to deal with journalists. Please note that it is two-way interactions. It isn't just spewing out information and having them make of it what they will. No, it is responding to those press queries. Public relations people sometimes most earn their paycheck when their client is in a time of crisis. Public relations people spring into action when a company's good name is being dragged into the mud. The first principle of crisis communication is to imagine all the sorts of negative things that could befall your company. If you're an airliner, have a plan for what happens if one of your plane crashes. If you're doing public relations for a chain of restaurants, well, have a plan for what happens if your food should start to sicken people. Another principle of crisis communication is to be honest. Lies have a habit of being uncovered, and it's pretty clear that oftentimes what brings someone down is not the original action. It is the lies that cover up that original action. Another principle of crisis communication is a certain humbleness. So if your client is wrong, then your client should apologize. And make it a real apology, not a qualified apology. Qualified apologies oftentimes will make people just angrier. Furthermore, an apology should include actions to help repair the damage. Another principle of crisis communication is to move quickly. We are in the era of the 24-hour news cycle. If your critics are lambasting your client, then try to get your response out immediately so that it can get into the same news reports. And while this is hard to do, a skilled public relations person should not hide from the media during a time of crisis. In fact, a good public relations person should be available to the media. Otherwise, the other side will get its story out and your client won't. This is literally a textbook example of a public relations crisis that was handled about as well as it could be handled. Tylenol, a well-known pain reliever, made by Johnson & Johnson, the very large pharmaceutical company. Many years ago, someone tampered with Tylenol extra strength capsules, put some sort of poisonous substance in them, and it led to the deaths of 7 people. Johnson & Johnson responded by immediately pulling the product off the shelves in Chicago. The idea was, let's not cause the death toll to grow. Now, the problem was that the story was moving very rapidly. It had quickly become a national story. I could remember in 1982, I was a graduate student here in Los Angeles, and the Tylenol story was big news. So in response to fears of people all across the country, Johnson & Johnson recalled the product nationwide. In other words, if a supermarket had it on its shelves or a convenience store or a drugstore, they were urged to just return it to Johnson & Johnson for a full refund. Same thing for consumers. If they had it in their medicine cabinet, even if they had half used the capsules, just give them back. They'll get a full refund, no questions asked. There are public relations firms that specialize in crisis communication. Burson Marsteller is one of those firms, and it was hired to handle this crisis for Johnson & Johnson. The product was reintroduced after some period of time off the market, and Johnson & Johnson, in reintroducing Tylenol, pioneered packaging that we now take for granted. They called it triple sealed. Originally, the capsules, which you could pull apart and the medicine would fall out, that had a little band about it. That was seal number 1. Those capsules were put in blister packages, where if it was pushed through the thin foil, that would be obvious. That was seal number 2. And then the box had a tape-like seal on it that if someone opened the box, it would be obvious. That would be seal number 3. Now, I know that that is just what you expect today, but it was pioneering back then. Communication went in all directions. Imagine those Johnson & Johnson sales reps that were talking to drugstore chains and supermarkets and even mom and pop convenience stores all over the country. They re-educated those customers into how Tylenol would be reintroduced with a level of safety in packaging that had never been done before. Johnson & Johnson also held press conferences where many, many journalists could interview figures at the company and could all write their stories, and carefully managed from Johnson & Johnson's perspective. Also, the head of Johnson & Johnson allowed himself to be interviewed by Mike Wallace, who was known as a particularly tough investigative journalist, by not only agreeing to be on the investigative news magazine show 60 Minutes, but to actually be interviewed by Mike Wallace. It was an indicator that the executive had nothing to hide. Tylenol quickly regained public trust, and to this very day is a leading pain reliever. If Johnson & Johnson is... Some years later, British Petroleum was involved in a very serious oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The BP spill involved an oil rig. And perhaps BP did a little bit better, but still, they were a little lacking in some ways. For example, BP's response focused on technical issues instead of focusing on the people and wildlife that were harmed. British Petroleum tried to shift the blame to one of their contractors, which, whether that was true or not, publicly trying to shift the blame just made BP look bad. And then third, it became pretty clear that BP, like Exxon those years before, did not have a well thought out crisis plan. Public relations and the internet. Certainly the job of a public relations person has changed as the internet has become more influential. It used to be that public relations people were all about getting flattering stories into newspapers, into magazines, onto television. But now a skilled public relations person can take the company's stories directly online and can bypass traditional journalism. On the other hand, there are some problems that the internet causes for modern public relations persons. What if your client is caught doing something unflattering and it's a video, and that video gets out there onto social media and it is going viral? It is spreading by the minute. It is very hard to defend against that. Furthermore, every large organization has a certain number of people who don't like the way things are being run. The internet makes it very easy for that disgruntled employee, whether that person has a good point or not, to leak that information directly online, even if journalists aren't interested in it. Furthermore, the internet is a fertile rumor mill. I wonder how it would have been handled in the internet age when a rumor went around quite a few years ago about the company Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble is a company that makes Tide detergent, Crest toothpaste, Crisco oil, a lot of very common everyday household products. Well, there was a rumor about them back in the 1980s that their old-fashioned company logo was actually a satanic logo. And it was a rumor that slowly spread, mostly by word of mouth, because it was such a silly rumor that mainstream media just didn't see it as worthy of covering. But okay, here's the question for you for the chat box. You are public relations counsel to Procter & Gamble. The rumor has become current again. You are finding that maybe 5% of the public, maybe 10, maybe 25% of the public has at least been exposed to the rumor that your company is somehow satanic. Do you have the head of your company call a press conference and state for the record that your company is not in league with Satan? See, there's a problem with that. It could spread the rumor even farther. So, what should you do? Skilled public relations people see social media as more than just a printing press. They see it as a place to engage in a dialogue with its publics, including those publics that maybe aren't too crazy about your organization. Another good thing about social media for public relations people is that it can foster ongoing relationships. Imagine a organization that has an uneasy relationship with local homeowners because they're afraid that this organization is getting too big and that maybe it will pollute and maybe it will dominate local politics and so on and so forth. Well, if you can have an ongoing relationship with those neighbors through social media, maybe they will begin to feel a little more comfortable with your client. Now, here's something I'd like you to put into the chat box. Are there any organizations or companies that you communicate with or that you have kind of an ongoing series of messages with through social media? Just to give you an example, I find that when I like something on Facebook, that oftentimes I will get posts from it. A lot of news begins with a public relations person. Public relations people, one of the first things that they learn how to do in introductory courses like MassComm 120, Intro to Public Relations here at Glendale College. One of the first things that public relations people learn how to do is how to write a press release. And a press release is something that looks like a basic news story about something that is arguably newsworthy that is going on about your client. A press conference. Public relations people organize press conferences when they have clients who a lot of reporters want to interview. I mean, let's say that if Glendale College had a professor who came up with a cure for coronavirus, you would have hundreds of reporters who would want to talk to this person. Well, we'd hold a press conference. Public relations people oftentimes write speeches for the head of the company and for other leaders. Public relations people sometimes create media events. For example, Milton Bradley, the maker of the Monopoly board game, some years ago, to celebrate the anniversary of the Monopoly board game, they invited real-life investment bankers to play Monopoly for real money with their winnings going to charity. It made for a very exciting game. Now, public relations people can suggest stories. Public relations people can give their input into stories, but they can't control what's going to be on the news. A lot of what happens in government is loosely public relations. Think about lobbyists. Glendale City Hall probably has a few lobbyists that are buzzing around it. LA City Hall no doubt has more lobbyists. The California State Capitol may have 1,000 lobbyists. And in Washington, more than 12,000 active registered lobbyists. All are seeking to persuade for their organization. It may be the Beet Growers Council. It may be the National Association of Used Car Dealers. It may be a large pharmaceutical company. Certainly when you think about a political campaign, that's a public relations campaign. Think about our political leaders as we battle coronavirus, thinking about how can we get the public to do what we want them to do, without panicking. That is a public relations problem. It's pretty typical that when someone is thinking about running for president, they write a book about themselves, kind of an early autobiography. Way back in 1995, Barack Obama wrote the book Dreams from My Father. And perhaps he was thinking about a future White House run, or maybe he was just thinking about running for Senate from Illinois. But in that book, he outed himself over drug use in college. Well, why would he do that? Well, so that in a later political campaign, the issue would already be diffused. If an opponent brings it up, then Mr. Obama or his campaign manager could say, yeah, we already dealt with that way back in 1995. Spin. While we are on the subject of politics, we should talk about spin. Spin is trying to get reporters to see a story from your perspective rather than your opponent's perspective. In political debates, there is typically what is called the spin room. And in the spin room, there are reporters and there are surrogates for the various candidates in the debate. Surrogates means representatives of. And the surrogates typically try to spin the perception of the debate in a way that is flattering for their candidate. Or think about public relations people who are trying to manage a crisis. They are trying to get the public to see the situation from the client's perspective, or at least as much as possible. That is essentially spin. Even America's civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s had a public relations component to it. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became active in the civil rights movement in the 1950s, there were already legal challenges to racial segregation in the court system. But Dr. King realized that to really get the public behind him, he needed to show in a very concrete way what segregation was and how it could be changed. Several years ago, I saw the movie Selma with David Oellio in the role of Dr. King. And I felt that one of the things that movie pointed up very powerfully was that Dr. King sent himself and his freedom riders not to towns where maybe they would be received fairly welcomely. No, they deliberately went to the places where they were the most unwelcome. They counted on an overreaction by local officials. And you would say, why? Well, because Dr. King also made sure that the northern journalistic media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, and so forth, that they would be there to see the injustice of the overreaction. And for heaven's sake, make sure the photographers photograph it too. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail is today a classic. I can remember reading it in an English class in about the 9th grade. Dr. King, among other things, wrote about how his young daughter wanted to go to an amusement park that had opened in the town where they lived. And he had to tell her they couldn't go. Not because they didn't have enough money, but just because of the way things were. And that letter also helped to bring sympathy, to heighten awareness. Among all the other things that it was, the civil rights movement was a very successful public relations campaign.